Hello, everybody, again, and welcome to the fourth ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The Future of Capitalism, Facing the New Anxieties. Our speaker is Professor Paul Collier from the University of Oxford. Paul today will tell us about the divides that are currently tearing apart our societies, about the geographical divide of the regions against the metropolis, about the social divide of the less educated against the more educated, about the global divide of the less developed countries against the more developed ones. These divides originate from the failure of modern capitalism in fulfilling its mission of steadily rising in standards for everybody and delivering for all. It has kept working for some, but has left others behind. The left behind are now hostages of the demagogues, ideologues, or populists. History is repeating itself. It happened already in the 30s. The current crisis of capitalism is also the crisis of social democracy. Paul will tell us about the philosophical grounding of this crisis, from Jeremy Bentham to Robert Nozick, passing through John Rawls. That is from utilitarianism to libertarianism, passing through the new contractualism. These shifts occurred in mainstream economics and economic policy's ethical grounding, is also how social democracy has lost its identity, that is the pragmatism of David Hume and Adam Smith. Paul will also tell how to close these divides, about the road to the ethical healing of our societies, the way out of despair for those left behind. This road is the road to ethical capitalism, the heart center, and the restoration of purpose. Without further ado, please let me introduce our speaker. Sir Paul Collier is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and a Fellow of St. Anthony's College. From 1998 through 2003, he took a 5-year public service leave, during which he was Director of the Research and Development Department of the World Bank. He is currently a Professor Invité at Sciences Po and the Director of the International Growth Center. He has written for the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. His research covered the causes and consequences of civil war, the effects of aid and problems of democracy in low-income and natural resources-rich societies, urbanization in low-income countries, private investment in African infrastructure, and changing organizational cultures. Paul has authored numerous books, including The Bottom Billion, Wars, Guns, and Boats, Democracy in Dangerous Places, The Plundered Planet, How to Reconcile Prosperity with Nature, Exodus, How Migration is Changing Our World, and The Future of Capitalism, Facing the New Anxieties. His latest book is Greed is Dead, Politics After Individualism. In 2014, Paul received a knighthood for services to promoting research and policy change in Africa. Many thanks again for being with us today. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed. And thanks for inviting me to this very distinguished series. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint, and so just let me guide you through what I'm going to say. It's going to be in 4 blocks, starting with the question, why is the European Union valuable? And then, if it's so valuable, what's the problem? And from there, why the problem is not, this particular problem, which is place-based collapse, is not solved by market forces. On the contrary, market forces make things worse. And then finally, I'll turn to the solution. So let me get started with why is the EU valuable? And there's no mystery about that. The European Union was founded to avoid another war between Germany and France, which had dragged most of the other European countries into that vortex of violence and conflict. So it was a very noble purpose of the EU to avoid another war, and that appealed to both rich people and poor people alike. having been through 3 devastating wars in just 70 years, everybody saw the rationale for just let's avoid another one. The strategy, that was the objective. It was a noble objective. And it was linked to a very straightforward, credible strategy. And it was to raise people up from the narrow protectionism of the 1930s. And that narrow protectionism, self-interest, would be replaced by reciprocal trade arrangements, reciprocal preferential trade, which would be producing an interdependent Europe, which would in turn make war materially impossible, in the famous phrase. So that was the strategy, and it lifted people up from that my interest now, which had produced 1930s protectionism, to our common future interest, which enabled people to look to this new strategy of reciprocal trade preferences. It was a strategy that was widely understood and accepted by rich people and poor alike. That role for the European community, which was a splendid role, is over. It's over because the prospect of war between Germany and France is completely over. It's no longer a credible fear. And Germany in particular is the most pacifist major power in human history. It's not going to fight anybody. And so that original rationale, peace in Europe, which was a wonderful, noble purpose, brilliantly achieved by a strategy, Europe needs a new rationale. What is the equivalent combination of a powerful reason and a compelling strategy? Now, I'm going to turn first to a little bit of evidence about human nature, which is pertinent here. And it comes from new advances in evolutionary biology. And the work that I'll be drawing on is Joe Heinrich, who's head of the Department of Evolutionary Biology at Harvard, Nicholas Christakis, who's head of evolutionary biology at Yale, and Michael Sandel, who's the most influential moral philosopher in the world. And they've all got brilliant brilliant books that even a non-specialist can read. So what does all this evolutionary biology show? It shows that humans are a very unusual mammal. We're much more pro-social than other mammals. We're goal-directed towards purposes, but we're still a mammal. That is to say, we're not saints. We're just not evolved to be saints. And depending on the ideas communicated by leaders, we can either be dragged down to the worst features of a mammal, which is greedy, lazy, and selfish, basically just a me now society, people screaming at each other, my interests now, or with better leaders, we can be raised up, not to sainthood, that's not on the menu, but we can be raised up to sacrifice me now for our common future, which is exactly what the European community did with that peace agenda. So to be valued, the European Union needs to find some combination of a noble purpose and a compelling strategy, which is widely accepted by rich and poor alike, because that is the thing which really motivates people. If they want to find the European union compelling, it won't be just a retreat into narrow self-interest. The European Union reduces frictions for business and so makes us better off. That won't do it. It has to be a morally uplifting purpose. And I'm going to argue that it's perfectly capable of doing that. So now let me turn to the problem. And here I'm going to draw on the Future of Capitalism and its sort of sequel, Greed is Dead, which I wrote with John Kay. And I should say, I'm also going to be drawing on work that I've done with Tim Besley over the years, John Kay over the years, and Tony Venables. Goes without saying that none of them are implicated in anything I'm going to say. It's just that I'm building on what I've learned from them. So, and I'm going to use examples from Britain, partly because I know it best, but mainly because it's the clearest example of the social and economic pressures which have emerged since the 1980s. It's an extreme case, and it's well studied. And of course, it doesn't have any invidious connotations of picking one part of the European Union out against another. So since the 1980s, Europe has been hit by economic and social forces that have undermined mutuality by creating new divisions and new anxieties. Potentially, I'm going to argue, they pose a mortal threat to the flagship policies of the European Union, namely the euro and free movement. So I'm going to first turn to the economic forces and then to the social forces, both of which have produced these new cleavages. So the economic forces are globalization and technological change. And they've created new cleavages, partly spatial and partly in between social classes. So the spatial divides, some cities lost their core industry to Asia. And the example I use in the book is my own home city of Sheffield, which had a specialist steel cluster, which had been there for 700 years, and was a very prosperous city when I grew up there. And then in the early 1980s, it collapsed. The steel industry collapsed, shifted to Korea, and the coal industry collapsed. And those were the two big industries. So all the big firms collapsed. So that was a spatial hit. The other spatial phenomenon is that there are increased returns to high-skill agglomeration in metropoles. And again, Britain's an extreme example with London. Very high-skill agglomeration. So that's the spatial divide between these broken provincial cities and the metropoles. There's a skill cleavage, because there's a loss of mid-skilled jobs due to technical change. And the best work to look up there is Danny Roderick's recent stuff. He's got a very good discussion of it in the latest Oxford Review of Economic Policy, which is an issue devoted to what's gone wrong with capitalism. So there's a loss of mid-skilled jobs. There's a loss of value in manual skills. For example, miners, coal miners, have massively lost value. The skill's useless in a lot of places. Shipbuilding, that skill is place-based, and in many places it's now worthless. So there's a loss of mid-skilled jobs, loss of value for particular manual skills in particular places, and there's a premium on highly educated skills, things like fancy lawyers. And this has produced the combination of the spatial divergence and the skill divergence has produced very powerful inequalities between on the successful, who are the metropolitan well-educated, and the people on the down escalator, who are the provincial less educated. So much for the economic changes. The social changes have been polarized. There've been a succession of shocks, of which COVID is the latest, where governments have been overconfident, overpromised, thought that they understood the situation when they didn't. They failed to recognize that there's an awful lot of irreducible uncertainties. And the key work here is by John Kay and Mervyn King, a book called Radical Uncertainty. Two of the top economists in Britain, who one the governor of the central bank, Bank of England, who have renounced the economics that they taught for years at a very high level. Radical uncertainty, and the lesson of radical uncertainty is when you don't know what's going on as a government, don't pretend. Instead, what you need is rapid learning from experiment. So that was one effect, the undermining of the overconfidence of governments, and that had repercussions in a loss of trust. Then there's been a loss of social cohesion, and I think, at least in part, that is because the successful, the people who really succeeded, started to peel off from shared identity with the less successful. They started to get their primary identity not from the place where they lived, but from the job that they did. And that switch in salient identity also had repercussions. That contributed to a loss of social cohesion. It was amplified by the rise of opportunists using social media. And I don't need to go into the details of that. You see it day by day. Between them, these resulted in a loss of trust in government by three distinct groups. One is the provincial less educated. They were on the down escalator in life, and they felt despairing that the government had let this happen. Another group was the old, who became very anxious at the pace of change and didn't understand it. And the third but most disturbing group that became anxious and lost trust in government was the young. And across Europe, there's shocking evidence that most young people in Europe expect that their future lives will be worse than their parents. That's a massive failure in public policy, because technical change should be lifting all of us by a couple of % a year. So these intense new anxieties by the young signal that something is drastically wrong across Europe. And the final and most disturbing thing of all this was that the most successful people not only peeled off from identity with everybody else, but started to disdain and detach from everybody else, from the provincial less educated. So they denigrated the provincial less educated. The most extraordinary discussion I've had on my books was with a very senior civil servant from Singapore who flew in, and the books were just covered in little bits of yellow stickers. And he said, do you realize this, this exactly explains the problem that we face in Singapore? And I was very puzzled because I said, but I thought I was explaining why Singapore had succeeded in its transformation in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And he said, oh, yes, 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 sure, sure. That was then. But now it's a very different story, because the peeling off of the successful from the unsuccessful, we are tracking, we know, because we're measuring the social interconnections between people. And the rich nowadays, the successful in Singapore, have no interactions with anybody else, with the poor, with the less successful. Now, I was astounded that they knew that, but they knew it because they really studied in detail the social networks. And of course, once you know there's a problem, you'll be able to fix it. But it was very impressive that they recognized this problem in Singapore, the problem of the peeling off of the successful. So let me turn now to the consequence of all this for places and for classes. And it's a concentrated impact on a few places and particular classes in those places. And so it's a very highly concentrated collapse in the economies of place of some people in some places. There's been a very good recent study of this for the crashes that occurred in British cities in the early 1980s. The early 1980s, British macroeconomic policy coincided with really a series of disastrous economic changes, economic policies that meant that 20 British cities collapsed, one of which was my own hometown of Sheffield, as I described. This work is by Rice and Venables, it's recent. So they studied what happened to the 20 top collapses of British provincial cities. And what they found was that 19 of them have not revived. One did. And the ironic thing is the one that revived suffered the biggest of all the collapses. So there's something very peculiar going on. So what is it? And the answer is that once a place really collapses, a lot of different problems set in, and they rapidly become a syndrome of problems that reinforce each other. So, for example, because the big firms collapse, there are no more jobs for people where they're on their skills are valuable in that firm. And so you find a lot of people with skills that have become redundant. But firms, new firms, don't want to come to these places because there isn't a cluster of similar firms. Nobody wants to be the first firm in a cluster because you might be the only firm in a cluster. Other firms might not come. And so new firms don't come because there isn't a cluster and there aren't the right skills. Meanwhile, people won't invest in new skills because there are no jobs for them to do. So that's an example of an interdependent syndrome. As people's incomes collapse, that has demand effects, so other jobs go. And as people become unemployed, they start to turn to crime. And so the place starts to become unsafe. So there's a series of these interdependent, self-reinforcing effects, which we can think of as a syndrome. The place gets into a backward-looking anger in which people blame either each other or the government for the failures in the society, in their place. If they blame each other, they cannot come together. And because they don't come together, what they get is failure. That failure is then interpreted as confirming their initial beliefs, that some other group in their place has caused the problem. It might be immigrants, it might be greedy firms, or it might be the big bad government out there that's caused the problem. Either way, you get an ergodic mapping from an initial set of bad ideas, which then produce outcomes which appear to confirm those bad ideas. And so it's this ergodic mapping that traps the society into persistent failure. Market forces actually just make that worse. Because the fundamental problem is you need a coordinated change across a lot of different networks that don't communicate with each other. And that explains why the puzzle, the most badly hit city in the whole of Britain, which was Corby, was the only one to recover. Why was that? Because it was so blindingly obvious that Corby was a disaster that the government intervened to set up a new development area there. And so public policy and public commitments reset expectations around a better future. And that, unfortunately, is the solution to these traps. You need to reset expectations, and that requires anchoring commitments by the public sector. So much for what's happened in Britain, these place-based collapses. Unfortunately, and now turn to Europe, these dangers are compounded by the EU flagship policies. Free movement, the euro, and the control of fiscal deficits. So free movement, a principle of the European Union, but what it's led to at the moment is because there have been these place-based collapses, the successful, the skilled people in these collapsed places find it better just to leave them and move to very successful places. So, for example, Romanian doctors about a third of Romania's doctors, and particularly the doctors in small towns where the place has collapsed, have left and gone to places like Paris, where they can earn much more. Now we can, in one sense, say that's efficient. They're earning more as doctors in Paris than they would earn in small-town Romania. But of course, that amplifies the problem of small-town Romania. It's hard to expect the parents of a sick child who's lost the doctor in small-town Romania to celebrate the freedom of the doctor to have gone to Paris. Right? So free movement is unfortunately at the moment amplifying because it's denuding these crash places of their most skilled people. The euro has removed a coordinating device for cutting wages and prices together in a place. And so it's left a sort of agony of uncoordinated attempts to cheapen labor or to lower prices. The fiscal deficit rule of 3% deficit has also removed the debt financing option for increased spending on places. And the upshot of that is that the places and people who've crashed, like Sheffield, now find themselves pretty well trapped in these ergodic, backward-looking blame games. And the archetypal example across Europe is Greece, which suffered a massive and persistent crash, and which has lost a lot of its skilled people. There were less powerful effects in both Spain and Italy, which have seen outflows of people. That risks entangling the European Union with polarization. The dangers are that the successful people, the most successful people in the metropolitan areas, support the project of United Europe, and therefore it gets opposed by the less successful people. And you see that very clearly in the Brexit vote, where London overwhelmingly voted in favor of remaining in Europe, and every provincial region in England voted against. And that's because the gulf in productivity between provincial England and London had opened to an astonishing 72%. So that's the problem and the danger of the entanglement of the European Union being supported only by the successful and not being supported by the people who've been hardest hit. And finally, I turn to the solution. And the solution is we need a new equivalent purpose to replace no more wars, and matched by an equivalent strategy that everybody can willingly sacrifice me now for our common future. And I'm going to suggest that the purpose that we need to reunite round is to reverse this divergence between successful and unsuccessful places. We need to address the new anxieties that are besetting, especially that are besetting youth, and healing these polarizations. So that's the purpose, bringing European peoples together with the least successful catching up with the more successful. That catching up process and that healing of the big rifts. What's the strategy that can do that? The strategy is place-based support, a massive expansion of the structural funds. So Europe's already got the principle and the mechanism, the structural funds, but they need to be very much bigger. I'm going to suggest some principles, a model to follow, and finally, the implication for learning. And so the principles, I'm going to suggest 3 principles. The first is that principle of subsidiarity, that by subsidiarity, Europe should have a common purpose, but the design and implementation should be devolved to the places that are struggling. And so both the design and the implementation need to be devolved not to a country government, but to a place. If southern Italy is really falling behind because it's losing its skilled people and new businesses won't come, that place, southern Italy or Sicily, has to be in the driver's seat of designing and implementing change, a strategy of change. Second principle, it has to be unbiased. So there have to be common standards by which all places are judged. And the European Commission is very good at common standards, quite rightly so. And the final principle is, just like the structural funds, it has to be subsidized. It has to be subsidized by a common purse. But it has to be done at a much bigger scale. Fortunately, there is a model to copy. There is a very clear European model from which we can all copy. And that is how West Germany has helped East Germany to recover from the catastrophe of communist Europe. So there was a principle, and that principle was embedded into the constitution of Germany. And it was a constitutional requirement of spatial balance. So I suggest that that should become a principle agreed by the European community, that it should be spatial balance should be a constitutional requirement across the European Union. Secondly, what Germany did was big, devolved, and sustained. It was very big. If you just look at the money that West Germany spent reviving East Germany, it was huge. Not only was it huge, but the agency for developing places was largely passed from Berlin to the places themselves. So Leipzig developed the plan for Leipzig, and so on. Big, devolved, and sustained. Sustained, it's been running for 30 years, and it's still not finished. Yeah? So those are the principles, the model to copy. And then finally, facing uncertainty, And all these processes, like the recovery of East Germany, is an uncertain journey. You need rapid learning as you go. Some things will work much better than expected, and other things will work much worse. You need to find out about that. So we need to have tracking, rapid tracking, evaluations of what is working well and what is working badly. Just to give you an example, we don't even know yet whether the experiment run by Sweden in COVID will turn out to be a good idea or a bad idea. We do know that there's been a lot of variation within both Europe and within the OECD as a whole in policy towards COVID and consequences. Just to give you one example to sum up with, the most successful to date in Europe, pretty well in the whole democratic world, has been Denmark. Denmark wasn't run by a towering intellectual genius. Mette Frederiksen will be the first person to say, I didn't know what to do. But what she understood was that it was contagious. People caught COVID from each other. And so she appealed to ordinary Danes. She said, we've all got a moral responsibility to protect our neighbors. If you're old like Paul here, stay out of the way so that young people can carry on working. If you're young, please don't inadvertently kill Grandad. And that message of moral responsibility to all Danes worked. They've had not only the lowest excess mortality to date from COVID, but they've had the lowest economic hit from COVID. So they didn't trade one against the other. By getting a lot of willing compliance from people, putting the moral responsibility onto people, just like the European Union did with that initial thing, we're going to achieve peace by reciprocal trade rather than by the retreating into individual protectionism. And I just want to finish by contrasting that protect your neighbor with what was happening at the same time in America. By then, America was being led by a bombastic idiot. It was had 40 years of vitriolic individualism and dragging people down to me now. And when the American population woke up to COVID in March 2020, what was the response of American people? Queues outside gun shops. It was less a case of protect your neighbor than shoot your neighbor. And it hasn't worked very well. So the final lesson from Joe Heinrich, which he calls the secret of our success as a species, is that we're very good at learning from the success of others. We copy success easily. And so as long as we get experimentation, evaluate it rapidly, and disseminate the fact that these things are working here, these things didn't work here, we will very rapidly copy the successful interventions in places. That when a Sicily works and recovers, then a lot of other places in Spain, in France, in Eastern Europe will copy. So that is the secret of our success, learning from others through rapidly evaluated experiments. On that note, let me close. In fact, I'll just have one last remark. I have done a lot of work all my life on Africa, and in particular, in my little book, The Bottom Billion, I argued that the poorest countries in the world were diverging from the more successful developing countries. I've just done the work that updates all that, and they are still diverging. They're diverging even more rapidly than they were before. And so there is an urgent and chronic need for the poorest countries of the world to catch up with everybody else, just as there's an urgent need within Europe for the least successful places to catch up with everywhere else. Thank you. Let me pass to questions.